Welcome to an emergency episode of the 7th Generation Podcast and Dr. B Teaches. After nearly 50 years of unjust incarceration, American Indian Movement member Leonard Peltier was granted clemency by the outgoing president, Joe Biden. 20 minutes before he left office, he did grant Leonard Peltier clemency. It is not a full pardon. It is clemency, and he will be on house arrest probably for the remainder of his life. While his release date is set for February 18th, we all hope that Leonard will be able to come home much sooner. This moment marks nearly 50 years of, in my opinion, unjust imprisonment of Leonard, but it also raises some critical questions. And today I want to dive deep into Leonard's case, his imprisonment over the past 5 decades, and the controversies surrounding his life, including the connection to Mae Aquash, who was murdered in 1975, the same year as the Jumping Bull shootout. I think it's also important to honor the memory of those who lost their lives during the Reign of Terror in the 1970s on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, whose stories have been completely buried, and those families also demand justice as well. To understand why Leonard's release is so monumental, you really need to revisit his story. Leonard is Native American activist, member of the American Indian Movement, who were prominent during the 1960s and the 1970s. He's Turtle Mountain Chippewa. He grew up under the shadow of the U.S. government's violent assimilation policies. Just at 9 years old, he was taken from his grandmother's family, his grandmother's home, and he was sent to a federally funded boarding school. And this is where Native Americans were stripped of their identity. They were physically abused and often humiliated for being Native American. And so Leonard is a survivor of this attempt at genocide. Years later, Leonard Peltier would become a member of the American Indian Movement and become involved in indigenous activism. This is during the 1960s and the 1970s when AIM is most prominent. And he fought to protect native lands, sovereignty, during a time of rampant federal neglect and violence against indigenous communities. Let's fast forward to the shootout on the Jumping Bull Ranch in 1975 on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. There was a shootout between members of the American Indian Movement, including Leonard Peltier, who was there, who was present, and 2 FBI agents. These 2 FBI agents, Jack Collier and Ronald Williams, were killed during this gunfight. Also, Joe Stuntz, a Native American activist, also lost his life. The federal government focused its blame on Leonard after Bob Robidoux and Dino Butler were both acquitted for the murder of these 2 FBI agents. And despite complete lack of evidence, they were able to get a conviction, and Leonard was sentenced to 2 life sentences for aiding and abetting the murder of these 2 FBI agents. Leonard's trial was a complete sham. It was tainted by constitutional violations, fabricated evidence, FBI misconduct on a major scale, everything from the Myrtle Poorbear affidavit that was used to get Leonard extradited back to the United States from Canada, where he was being held, to the ballistics evidence. There was just so much that was against Leonard, partially because the federal government needed to hold somebody responsible. So Even the government today has admitted that they don't even know who actually killed these two agents, but Leonard was held responsible. Bob Robidoux, Dino Butler were acquitted. Leonard was tried after their trial had ended and he was convicted, and he's been in prison for nearly 50 years in maximum security prisons. He's been shot, he's been stabbed, 80 years old. Somehow, some way, he's been able to survive all this time behind bars. And also, for nearly 50 years, Leonard has maintained his innocence. And since that time, he's become a symbol of resistance for Native people and, of course, the oppression of indigenous communities worldwide. To fully understand the events leading up to Leonard's incarceration, we have to talk about the Reign of Terror on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in the 1970s. This is a time when the United States federal government is arming and supporting vigilante groups to crush any type of Native American resistance. And that's really what the AIM movement was all about. It was about supporting indigenous communities. It was about bringing up issues that Native Americans were dealing with, everything from the Termination Act to relocation. You saw the takeover of Alcatraz Island. You had the occupation at Wounded Knee, and prior to that, you had the Trail of Broken Treaties, which resulted in the BIA takeover in Washington, D.C. But over a 3-year period during this reign of terror, more than 60 indigenous people are murdered. Activists, elders, men, women, and children. And these murders were rarely investigated by tribal police or the federal government. And the families of these victims are still waiting for justice today. One of the most prominent cases during this time is the murder of Mae Aquash. She's a young Mi'kmaq activist. She joins AIM and becomes a prominent figure within the movement. And she is found in 1976. Initially, they do not identify her. She's actually buried as a Jane Doe, and they claim that she died of exposure. Her body was later exhumed, and the autopsy revealed that she was shot in the back of the head, execution style. For decades, Annie Mae's murder has haunted Native American communities and has definitely been a source of controversy surrounding the American Indian movement and Leonard Peltier. And let me be clear, Leonard, in my view, had nothing to do with the death of Annie Mae. However, Annie Mae's family, her daughter Denise, has repeatedly said that Leonard was complicit in her murder. And we do know that 2 members of the American Indian movement have been convicted of killing Annie Mae. I think it's also important to mention as well that Annie Mae's family, her community, her supporters also believe that high-ranking members of the American Indian movement were in some way responsible, if not complicit at the very least, for the murder of their sister. However, Leonard has always maintained that he had nothing to do with what happened to Annie Mae. And I believe that is true. However, there is a story that Annie Mae was interrogated aggressively by Leonard and that he put something to her head and he interrogated her about her possibly being an FBI agent, which was a very prominent tactic used by the FBI during the COINTELPRO days, where the federal government was looking to destabilize and destroy any social movement, whether it was the Black Panther Party, the American Indian movement, any organization that went against the status quo became a target by the federal government, including the American Indian movement. And one of the strategies that they used was badjacketing somebody, basically accusing somebody of being an informant and creating chaos within the movement. And there were people who had become FBI informants, and there is some evidence that possibly it was the FBI who is responsible for the murder of Annie Mae, and that an FBI informant was the one who is most responsible for what happened to Annie. And so her family does deserve justice. But I want to make it clear that I don't believe that Leonard had anything to do with her murder. What happened to Annie is so tragic and so awful, and it's sickening that she lost her life in the way that she did. But Leonard's imprisonment had nothing to do with what happened to Annie Mae. He was imprisoned for killing 2 FBI agents. Leonard's conviction is rooted in the FBI's need to scapegoat somebody for the death of these 2 FBI agents. And that does not mean that we forget about what happened to Annie Mae. It doesn't mean that we forget about the individuals who lost their lives during the Reign of Terror. All of this is interconnected, and all of this is so incredibly tragic. And I do believe that Annie Mae's family deserves answers. I don't know if they're ever going to get the answers that they want. And we should never forget the sacrifices that so many people made during this time, including Annie Mae. So I do want to make that clear. I do understand that the family does believe that Leonard was complicit, at the very least, in her murder. But I encourage all of you, definitely check out Red Nation Podcast. They've done several episodes on this. And there are people who do back up Leonard in saying that he never interrogated her in the way that people claim he interrogated her, that they were friends, that they were comrades, that they were fighting together. And it's important to remember that this was a very dangerous time. And there was the COINTELPRO program, the FBI, informants who were doing everything to create some type of chaos within the movement. And it's my belief that the people most responsible for what happened to Leonard and to Annie Mae and to all those people who lost their lives during this time is the federal government and the FBI. And for me, that's the most important thing to remember. The federal government, the FBI, all the policies, all the laws, whether it's relocation, the Termination Act, the federal boarding school system, all these policies and laws were meant to eliminate indigenous peoples, to destroy indigenous culture. And that's what Leonard, Annie Mae, the American Indian movement, and all these activists were fighting against. There's been so much propaganda that's been put out there by the federal government to give this impression that the American Indian movement were a bunch of misogynists, that they had no respect for women. And we forget all the women, including Annie Mae, who played such a major role in the movement, in the activism that's taking place during this time. People like Madonna Thunderhawk and Jean Roach, all the women that were behind the scenes doing the hard work. There was always this focus on the men in the movement. But the American Indian movement was a movement of families. It was a movement of men, women, and children, of indigenous communities fighting together. And that's something that the federal government has tried to obscure, and they've tried to recreate this narrative that the American Indian movement was a toxic, male-dominated social movement that did no good for indigenous communities. And that's just completely false. And like I said, the American Indian movement was a movement of families, men, women, children, and elders. People were trying to come together to create a better future. Were they perfect? Absolutely not. Should we heroify Leonard and prop him up? No. Can we celebrate the fact that he's been released after 50 years of being locked up in some of the worst places on the planet? Absolutely. His clemency is the result of decades of activism. There's people who aren't even alive today to witness this time where he will be able to go home and spend the rest of his life being surrounded around his loved ones, being able to hug his grandchildren, being able to be around the culture that he fought to protect. And while this moment is obviously incredibly important, we can't forget the others who lost their lives during the Reign of Terror. Their families definitely deserve answers, accountability, and some kind of justice. And of course, we can't forget Mae Aquash. She was stolen from her family way too soon. And we owe it to her and her family to keep demanding the truth. And I do hope that her community, her supporters, her daughters, at some point in time, have some type of closure. All right, I want to thank everybody for tuning in to Dr. B Teaches and the 7th Generation podcast. As always, I'm really curious what your thoughts are, so feel free to comment in the comment section. I also want to encourage everyone to continue to educate yourself about Indigenous issues. The story of Leonard is just one of so many stories that have been buried, just like they tried to bury Leonard for these 5 decades that he spent behind bars. They've tried to bury so many stories of resistance, stories of Indigenous resilience that need to be shared, that need to be told. So definitely feel free to share my content. If you got something from this, please subscribe to Dr. B Teaches. Also, my podcast can be found on all major platforms. Just search 7th Generation Podcast. You can check me out on Instagram. My handle is 7th Gen Podcast. I'm also on TikTok. TikTok is back up at the moment, and my handle is Merciless Savages. And of course, you can always check me out on YouTube. Don't forget to subscribe to Dr. B Teaches. And again, thank you for listening to this emergency episode. To all the people supporting my content, I appreciate all of you. This has been a really fun journey for me, being able to talk about Indigenous issues and to bring you some stories that have inspired me. Leonard's Story, I learned about years ago, was always a big inspiration for me. What the American Indian movement was trying to do for Indigenous communities across Turtle Island inspired me to want to do better in my life. And I hope these stories inspire some type of positive change in your life and also bring some kind of healing to Indian country. So until next time, y'all stay strong, stay resilient, and remember that justice is always worth fighting for.